Today we are delighted to bring you a timeless classic in a whole new light, a retelling of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a story of redemption, compassion, and the spirit of Christmas, following the journey of Ebenezer Scrooge as he transforms from a miserly, lonely man to someone filled with warmth and generosity. We hope you enjoy this immersive experience, crafted with cinematic art, music, and narration to capture the magic of the season. Please note that this audiobook does not infringe upon the rights of any individuals. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we appreciate each of you for watching. Please relax, enjoy the story, and may the spirit of Christmas fill your heart. Chapter 1. Ebenezer Scrooge was a man consumed by wealth and bitterness. Though he was wealthy beyond most men's wildest dreams, his heart was as cold as the harsh winter air outside his office window. To him, money was the only thing in the world that mattered, and he guarded it jealously, refusing to share even the smallest fraction with anyone in need. He was miserly, selfish, and profoundly alone, and he preferred it that way. Scrooge's office, cramped and dimly lit, was a reflection of the man himself. The walls were bare, the furniture old and uncomfortable, and the only decoration was the occasional pile of receipts and ledgers stacked high on his desk. In the corner of the room sat Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, hunched over his work. Cratchit wore threadbare clothes, his hands red and raw from the cold, for Scrooge refused to spend even a penny on extra coal to heat the room. Cratchit shivered in silence, fearing that a complaint might cost him his job, and he couldn't afford to lose it, especially now, with Christmas just around the corner. Christmas meant nothing to Ebenezer Scrooge. To him, it was merely an annual nuisance, a day when everyone insisted on leaving work early, spending frivolously and giving without reason. Bah, he thought, a humbug if ever there was one. Scrooge couldn't fathom why people wasted their time and money on something as meaningless as Christmas. "If I could work through Christmas Day, I would," he would often mutter to himself. On this particular Christmas Eve, a cheerful knock came at the office door. Before Scrooge could even respond, his nephew Fred burst into the room, a broad smile on his face, his cheeks rosy from the cold outside. "Merry Christmas, Uncle Ebenezer," he exclaimed, his voice filled with warmth. Scrooge looked up from his work, his expression souring. "Humbug," he grumbled, barely glancing at Fred. "Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "And what right have you to be dismal?" Fred replied, undeterred. "You're rich enough," Scrooge scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Bah, don't be foolish, Fred. What good has Christmas ever done you?" "It brings me joy," Fred answered earnestly. "It's a time of kindness, generosity, and forgiveness, Uncle. It's the one time of year when people open their hearts and remember what truly matters. Kindness, generosity, forgiveness," Scrooge mocked, sneering. "A waste of time and money. If I had my way, every fool who went around with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." Fred shook his head, saddened by his uncle's cynicism. "Uncle, I won't let you dampen my spirits. I came here to invite you to Christmas dinner tomorrow. Please join us, we'd love to have you." "Dinner?" Scrooge said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'd rather not, thank you. I prefer to spend my time profitably, not waste it on trivial celebrations." Fred sighed, his smile faltering. "Very well, Uncle, but I'll continue to wish you a Merry Christmas, whether you like it or not." With that, Fred left, his warmth lingering in the room even after he closed the door behind him. Scrooge returned to his work, muttering about the foolishness of youth and the wastefulness of Christmas. Shortly after, two men entered the office, their faces kind and hopeful. "Mr. Scrooge, sir," one of them began, tipping his hat respectfully. "We're collecting donations for the poor this Christmas. There are many who are cold and hungry." "Are there no prisons?" Scrooge interrupted. "Prisons, sir," the man replied, taken aback. "Yes, prisons, and the workhouses. Are they still in operation?" "Well, "Yes," the man said hesitantly, "but I wish I could say they weren't. Many people would rather die than go there." "If they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population," Scrooge retorted coldly. "I'm not interested in supporting idleness. Good day, gentlemen." The men, dismayed, left the office without another word. Bob Cratchit, watching from his desk, felt a pang of sorrow at his employer's words, but he said nothing. He couldn't afford to cross Scrooge. As the day wore on, Scrooge kept a close eye on the clock. Finally, as it neared the end of the workday, Bob Cratchit mustered the courage to speak. "Mr. Scrooge," he said timidly, Might I leave a bit early? It is Christmas Eve, after all." "Leave early?" Scrooge growled, raising an eyebrow. "And what's this about tomorrow? Do you expect to take the whole day off?" "Well, sir, it's Christmas," Cratchit stammered, trying to remain polite. "Just one day, sir." "One day?" Scrooge sneered. "And I suppose I'm to pay you for that day too? A whole day's wages wasted for nothing." Cratchit hung his head. "It's only once a year, sir." "Once a year," Scrooge muttered, shaking his head. "Fine then, but be here all the earlier the next morning." "Thank you, sir, thank you," Cratchit said, grateful and relieved. As Cratchit hurried out the door to join his family, Scrooge remained in the dim, cold office, grumbling to himself about the absurdity of it all. The world, he thought, had gone mad. People wasting time and money on trivialities, celebrating a holiday that meant nothing. Christmas to him was just another day, a day he preferred to spend alone, in peace. When he finally left his office, the streets were empty, the shops closed, and the only sounds were the distant chimes of church bells and the faint laughter of families gathered together. Scrooge trudged through the snow, his heart as cold as the winter air. He cared nothing for the joy of others. He resented it, in fact, for he saw it as a reminder of everything he had willingly cast aside: friendship, love, and family. Arriving home, he entered his dark, silent house. It was a large, imposing structure, but empty, filled only with shadows and memories. Scrooge lit a single candle, its dim light casting eerie shapes on the walls. He locked the door and sat by the faint glow of the fire, sipping a thin, flavourless broth for his supper. As the clock struck midnight, Scrooge felt an unusual chill settle over the room. He shivered despite the fire and glanced around nervously. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow move, a faint, ghostly figure lingering near the door. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. But deep down, a sense of unease began to grow, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would challenge everything he believed in, something that would force him to confront the man he had become. Unbeknownst to him, Christmas Eve would mark the beginning of a journey, one that would change his life forever. And so, as Scrooge drifted into an uneasy sleep, he remained blissfully unaware of the spirits that awaited him, the ghosts who would soon enter his life and show him a truth he had long denied. Christmas, he would come to realize, was not a mere inconvenience. It was a time for redemption, a time to open one's heart and embrace the joys of the season. But for now he slept, alone and unfeeling, his heart as cold as the snow-covered streets outside, oblivious to the transformation that awaited him. Chapter 2. As Ebenezer Scrooge sat alone in his cold, dark house, the air around him grew heavy and still. The faint glow of the dying fire cast eerie shadows on the walls, and Scrooge found himself shivering, though he was unsure if it was from the cold or an unsettling feeling creeping into his bones. Just as the clock struck midnight, an inexplicable chill filled the room. The flickering flames seemed to dim further, and Scrooge's heart began to race, an unusual sensation for a man so controlled and composed. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence, a low metallic clanking, as though chains were being dragged across the floor. Scrooge sat up, straining to hear, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing through the empty house until it seemed to be right outside his door. He rose from his chair, clutching his robe tightly around him, and took a hesitant step forward, his gaze fixed on the door, and then, to his horror, a ghostly figure passed through the door as though it were made of mist. It was a spectral image of a man Scrooge had known well, Jacob Marley, his former business partner, who had passed away 7 years earlier. But this was not the Marley he remembered. This Marley was pale and gaunt, his face lined with anguish, and he was bound in heavy chains, dragging them as he floated into the room. Scrooge's mouth fell open, and he stumbled back, his voice trembling. Mr. Marley?" he stammered, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Yes, it is I, Ebenezer," the ghost replied, his voice hollow and mournful. "I am the spirit of Jacob Marley, condemned to wander the earth, burdened by the chains I forged in life." Scrooge shook his head, his mind reeling. But why are you here? And why are you chained like this?" Marley's ghost let out a low, sorrowful sigh. "These chains are the weight of my sins, Ebenezer. In life I was selfish and greedy, just as you are now. I cared only for my wealth, ignoring the needs of others, and now I pay the price in death. I am doomed to walk the earth for all eternity, never finding peace." Scrooge's eyes widened and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob." "Business!" Marley's ghost exclaimed, his voice filled with regret and bitterness. "Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, kindness, that was my business. But I ignored those things, and now I am cursed to suffer for it." Scrooge felt a pang of fear, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "But surely, Jacob, there's nothing I can do. I'm too old to change my ways." Marley's ghost shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness. "It is not too late, Ebenezer, but you must heed my warning. Tonight, you will be visited by 3 spirits. They will show you the path you are on and what awaits you if you do not change." Scrooge swallowed, his throat dry. 3 spirits? "Yes," Marley replied. "The first will come at 1 o'clock, the second at 2, and the third at 3. Listen to them, Ebenezer, and learn from them, for they are your only chance at redemption." With that, Marley's ghost began to fade, his form dissolving into the air. But his final words lingered, echoing in the silence. "Remember, Ebenezer, remember." Scrooge stood there alone once more, his heart pounding, his mind racing with thoughts he had long buried. For the first time in his life he felt a glimmer of fear, a sense that his fate was no longer entirely within his control. He sat back down, staring into the dying fire, lost in thought, as the minutes ticked by toward the first spirit's arrival. As the clock struck 1, Scrooge's eyes snapped open. He had drifted into an uneasy sleep, but the sound of the clock jolted him awake, and he looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, the air still, but he sensed that he was no longer alone. A soft, warm light began to fill the room, growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. Scrooge shielded his eyes, squinting into the light, and then he saw her, a figure bathed in a gentle glow, radiating warmth and kindness. It was the ghost of Christmas past, a spirit who seemed ageless, with a soft, ethereal beauty that made her seem both young and old at once. "Ebenezer Scrooge," the spirit said, her voice like a whisper on the wind. "I am the ghost of Christmas past. I have come to show you the shadows of the Christmases that have been." Scrooge felt a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Why have you come to show me these things?" "To remind you of who you once were, and to show you the choices that led you to the man you are today," the spirit replied. "Come, Ebenezer, take my hand, and let us journey into your past." Reluctantly, Scrooge reached out and took the spirit's hand. Instantly, he felt himself being transported, the room around him dissolving, replaced by a familiar landscape he hadn't seen in years. He found himself standing outside his childhood home, a modest, humble house nestled in a quiet village blanketed with snow. Scrooge gasped, recognizing the scene. It was his childhood, a time he had long tried to forget. He watched as his younger self, a lonely boy with a solemn expression, sat by the window, staring out at the snowy world beyond. He was alone, left behind by his classmates, who had gone home to their families for the holiday. "Do you remember this Christmas?" the spirit asked, her voice gentle. Scrooge nodded, his heart aching at the memory. "Yes, I was always alone. My father, he didn't care for me. He sent me away to boarding school, and I spent every Christmas by myself." The spirit looked at him, her gaze filled with compassion. "You were a lonely child, Ebenezer, but even then you longed for companionship, for family. Do you remember?" Scrooge nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He watched as his younger self sat there, his eyes filled with sadness, longing for a love he would never know. The scene shifted, and Scrooge found himself standing in a bustling, warm room filled with laughter and music. It was his first job, working as an apprentice under the kind-hearted Mr. Fezziwig. He saw himself as a young man, laughing and dancing at the annual Christmas party Fezziwig held for his employees. Chapter 3. When the clock struck 2, Scrooge opened his eyes once more, his heart racing as he awaited the next spirit. He sat up, listening intently to the silence that filled his dark, cold room. Suddenly, a warm, vibrant light flooded the space, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Scrooge turned, shielding his eyes, and there, standing before him, was a figure unlike any he had ever seen. The spirit was a large, jovial man, dressed in a rich green robe trimmed with white fur. A wreath of holly adorned his head, and he held a torch that emitted a soft, comforting light. His face was merry, his eyes twinkling with kindness and joy. Scrooge felt a sense of awe and warmth just being in the spirit's presence. Come in and know me better, man," the spirit boomed, his voice rich and hearty. Scrooge, taken aback, nodded respectfully. "Are you the spirit of Christmas present?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I am," the spirit replied, smiling broadly. "I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me." Scrooge did as he was told, taking in the spirit's grand and generous presence. He couldn't help but feel humbled in the face of such abundance and warmth. The spirit extended a hand, inviting Scrooge to come closer. "Touch my robe," the spirit said, "and we shall journey together." Without hesitation, Scrooge reached out, placing his hand on the spirit's robe. In an instant, they were transported from his dark, cold room into the bustling streets of the city. It was Christmas morning, and the city was alive with activity. People hurried to and fro, arms filled with gifts, food, and other delights for the holiday. There was laughter, singing, and an undeniable warmth that seemed to fill the very air. Scrooge watched in awe as families gathered, friends embraced, and children played in the snow. For a moment, he felt a pang of longing, a desire to be part of this joy, this sense of togetherness that he had spent his life avoiding. The spirit led Scrooge through the streets, showing him scenes of celebration and kindness. They passed by homes filled with the sounds of laughter and music, churches with bells ringing joyously, and marketplaces where people greeted each other with warmth and cheer. Scrooge saw people of all ages and backgrounds sharing in the spirit of Christmas, united by the common thread of love and generosity. Then the spirit led Scrooge to a small, humble house nestled on a quiet street. Scrooge recognized it at once. It was the home of his clerk, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge watched as the spirit raised his torch, illuminating the scene within. Inside, the Cratchit family was gathered around a modest table, preparing for their Christmas meal. Bob Cratchit, though weary from his long hours of work, wore a cheerful smile as he set the table. His wife, dressed in a worn but clean apron, placed a small goose on the table, a humble meal, but one prepared with love and care. Their children, full of excitement, waited eagerly, their faces shining with joy. And there, at the centre of it all, was Tiny Tim, Bob Cratchit's youngest son. The boy was frail and pale, his body weakened by illness, but his spirit was bright and full of hope. He sat with a crutch by his side, his eyes filled with a kindness and innocence that touched Scrooge's heart in a way he could not explain. As Scrooge watched the Cratchits, he felt a strange warmth fill his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. There was something about the way this family, despite their poverty, found joy in each other's company that stirred something deep within him. He found himself drawn to Tiny Tim, the small, fragile boy who seemed to radiate a kindness and resilience that defied his circumstances. "Spirit," Scrooge whispered, his voice soft. "Why is Tiny Tim so frail?" The spirit's face grew solemn. "He is very ill, Ebenezer. Without proper care and support, he may not survive to see another Christmas." Scrooge felt a pang of sorrow, his gaze fixed on the boy. Tiny Tim was a child full of hope and kindness, a child who brought light and love into the lives of his family despite his own suffering. The thought of losing such a gentle soul filled Scrooge with a sadness he could not ignore. "Is there nothing that can be done?" Scrooge asked, his voice trembling. The spirit looked at him, his expression filled with both kindness and reproach. "That depends on the choices of others, Ebenezer. There are many in need, many who suffer, but few who offer help. Tiny Tim's fate is not set in stone, but if things continue as they are..." Scrooge lowered his head, his heart heavy with guilt. He knew that he was one of those who had the power to help, yet he had chosen not to. He thought of the money he hoarded, the wealth he guarded so jealously, and realized that it had blinded him to the needs of others, to the suffering that lay beyond his cold, isolated life. The spirit placed a gentle hand on Scrooge's shoulder, and together they watched as the Cratchit family began their Christmas meal. Bob Cratchit raised his glass, his voice filled with gratitude. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, everyone," Tiny Tim echoed, his voice soft but full of warmth. Scrooge felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he quickly brushed it away, unwilling to reveal the depth of his emotions. He could not deny the impact of what he had witnessed, the love, the resilience, the gratitude of a family who had so little, yet found joy in each other. It was a stark contrast to his own life, a life filled with wealth but devoid of happiness. The spirit turned to Scrooge, his expression both gentle and firm. "Remember what you have seen, Ebenezer. There are those who suffer, those who struggle, but who find solace in the kindness of others. Christmas is a time to give, to share, to open one's heart. You have the power to make a difference if you choose to do so." Scrooge nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices. He felt a glimmer of understanding, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not too late for him to change. But before he could speak, the spirit began to fade, his form dissolving into the light, leaving Scrooge alone once more. As the light faded, Scrooge found himself back in his dark, silent room. But something within him had shifted, a seed of change planted deep in his heart. He sat in the stillness, contemplating all he had seen, his mind racing with thoughts and feelings he had long suppressed. The spirit had shown him a world he had ignored, a world filled with love, joy, and compassion, and as he sat in the darkness, Scrooge wondered if he might one day be a part of that world, if he could find it within himself to open his heart and embrace the true spirit of Christmas. Chapter 4. As the clock struck 3, Scrooge opened his eyes, his heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. The room was cloaked in darkness, and a chilling silence hung in the air. He sat up, shivering, waiting for the final spirit to make its appearance. Suddenly, a deep, ominous shadow began to form in the corner of the room, growing larger and darker until it took the shape of a figure cloaked in black, towering over him with an aura of dread. The figure was silent, its face hidden beneath a hood, and its very presence filled Scrooge with an overwhelming sense of fear. He knew instinctively that this was the ghost of Christmas yet to come, the spirit that would reveal the final, most terrifying vision. "Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold?" Scrooge asked, his voice trembling. The spirit said nothing, merely nodding in response. It raised a bony hand, pointing toward the door, signaling for Scrooge to follow. Scrooge hesitated, a chill running down his spine, but he knew he had no choice. He rose to his feet, his hands shaking, and followed the ghost out of the room, stepping into a world cloaked in darkness and shadows. The spirit led Scrooge through the cold, empty streets of the city. The usual festive decorations and holiday cheer were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the streets were deserted, the buildings shrouded in darkness, as if the very life had been drained from the city. Scrooge shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him as he trailed behind the silent figure, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Finally, they stopped outside a small, dilapidated building. The spirit gestured toward the window, and Scrooge peered inside. There, in a dimly lit room, a group of people sat around a table, their faces filled with apathy and indifference. They spoke in hushed tones, their expressions cold and detached, as though they were discussing something trivial. "Who are these people, spirit?" Scrooge whispered, his heart heavy with unease. The spirit pointed toward one of the men at the table, and Scrooge listened closely as the man spoke. "I hear old Scrooge finally kicked the bucket," he said with a shrug, a faint smirk on his face. "Good riddance, I say." The others nodded in agreement, some even chuckling. "No one will miss him," another man added. "He was a miserly old fool, cared for nothing and no one but himself. Let him rot." Scrooge recoiled, his heart sinking as he realized they were speaking about him. The cold, uncaring words pierced his heart like a knife, filling him with shame and sorrow. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, guarding it jealously, only to find that, in death, he would be remembered with nothing but contempt. The spirit gestured for Scrooge to follow, and they moved on, passing through the empty streets once more. They came to a small, humble home, and Scrooge recognized it at once. It was the Cratchit household. He peered through the window and saw Bob Cratchit sitting by the fire, his face pale and weary, his eyes filled with grief. Mrs. Cratchit sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression one of quiet sorrow. Scrooge looked around the room, searching for Tiny Tim, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the terrible truth. "Spirit," Scrooge whispered, his voice filled with anguish, "where is Tiny Tim? Why is he not here?" The spirit turned to him, its silence more powerful than words, and pointed toward a small chair by the fireplace, a chair that now sat empty. Scrooge's heart broke as he understood the meaning of the empty chair, the absence that filled the room with sorrow. Tiny Tim, the boy who had embodied hope and kindness, was gone. Scrooge felt tears sting his eyes as he watched the Cratchits mourn in silence. The love and warmth that had once filled their home was now tinged with grief, a painful reminder of the fragility of life. He realized in that moment the impact of his choices, the consequences of his greed and indifference. If he had been more generous, more compassionate, he could have helped Tiny Tim, given him a chance to live. The spirit gestured once more, leading Scrooge away from the Cratchit household, away from the sorrow and regret that now filled his heart. They moved through the shadows, the world around them growing colder and darker, until they came to a desolate graveyard. The spirit stopped before a lonely, neglected grave, its headstone weathered and cracked, forgotten by all. Scrooge's heart raced as he looked at the grave, his hands trembling. He knew, without needing to ask, that this was his own final resting place. The spirit pointed to the headstone, urging Scrooge to look closer. With a heavy heart, Scrooge approached the grave and read the inscription carved into the stone, Ebenezer Scrooge. He fell to his knees, overcome with sorrow and despair, his mind racing with regrets. "Spirit," he cried, his voice filled with desperation. "Is this the future that must be, or merely the future that might be? Tell me, is there any hope for me? Can I change my fate?" The spirit remained silent, its gaze fixed on Scrooge, offering no answer, no reassurance. Scrooge buried his face in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks as he realized the depth of his mistakes, the life he had wasted, the opportunities he had squandered. "I will change," he vowed, his voice choked with emotion. "I will become a better man. I will embrace the spirit of Christmas. I will be kind. I will be generous. Please, Spirit, grant me this one chance to redeem myself." The spirit's form began to dissolve, fading into the darkness, leaving Scrooge alone in the graveyard, his heart heavy with the weight of his promise. As the last remnants of the spirit disappeared, Scrooge felt himself slipping into darkness, a cold, empty void that seemed to consume him. And then, suddenly, he awoke with a gasp, his eyes snapping open, his heart racing as he found himself back in his own bed, in his own room. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm, golden light over everything. Chapter 5. Scrooge sat up, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and joy. He was alive, he was here, and he had been given a second chance. He leapt out of bed, a broad smile spreading across his face as he realized the magnitude of the gift he had been given. This was Christmas morning, and he had the opportunity to change his life, to make amends for his past. "Merry Christmas!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. "Merry Christmas to one and all!" Without wasting another moment, Scrooge dressed himself in his finest clothes, his heart brimming with excitement. He threw open the window, calling down to a young boy who happened to be passing by. "You there, my boy," he called, his voice filled with warmth. "Do you know if the butcher still has the prize turkey?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "The one as big as me, sir?" "Yes, that's the one," Scrooge replied, laughing with joy. "Go and buy it for me, and I'll pay you handsomely for your trouble. Tell the butcher to bring it to Bob Cratchit's house. I want it there as soon as possible." The boy nodded eagerly, dashing off down the street, and Scrooge couldn't help but laugh, a sound that felt strange and new to him. He continued down the street, greeting everyone he met with a cheerful, "Merry Christmas." The people of the city stared at him in astonishment, for they had never seen Ebenezer Scrooge in such high spirits. As he walked, he felt a warmth in his heart, a sense of joy and fulfillment that he had never known. He felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, as if he were truly free for the first time in his life. Scrooge's first stop was his nephew Fred's house. He knocked on the door, and when Fred opened it, he looked shocked to see his uncle standing there, a wide smile on his face. "Uncle Ebenezer?" Fred asked, bewildered. "Yes, Fred, it's me," Scrooge replied, his voice filled with warmth. "I've come to accept your invitation to Christmas dinner, if you'll still have me." Fred's face lit up with joy, and he welcomed Scrooge inside, introducing him to his family and friends. They shared a wonderful meal together, filled with laughter, stories, and warmth. For the first time in years, Scrooge felt the joy of companionship, the love of family, and the simple pleasures of a holiday shared with others. But Scrooge wasn't done yet. After dinner, he made his way to the Cratchit household, where he was greeted with astonishment. Bob Cratchit, upon seeing the large turkey and Scrooge's beaming smile, could hardly believe his eyes. "Mr. Scrooge?" Bob asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes, Bob, it's me," Scrooge replied, laughing, "and I have come to make amends. From this day forward, I want to help you and your family. Your salary will be increased, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that Tiny Tim receives the care he needs." Bob's eyes filled with tears, and he thanked Scrooge with a gratitude that went beyond words. The Cratchit family gathered around Scrooge, embracing him as one of their own, and in that moment Scrooge knew that he had found a family he had never known he needed. From that day on, Ebenezer Scrooge became known throughout the city as a man of compassion and kindness. He gave generously to those in need, helped his neighbours, and opened his heart to the joy and love that he had once shunned. The spirit of Christmas lived within him, not just on one day, but every day of the year. And as for Tiny Tim, he lived and he grew strong, for Scrooge had made it his mission to ensure that the boy received the care he needed. The Cratchits thrived, and Scrooge became a beloved friend to them all, a constant presence in their lives. In the years that followed, Scrooge looked back on that Christmas Eve with gratitude, for it had been the night that changed his life. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be the man he had always wished he could be. And he made the most of it, spreading kindness, joy, and love wherever he went. As the people of the city would say, if there ever was a man who kept Christmas in his heart, it was Ebenezer Scrooge. And so the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the miser who became a man of generosity, lives on as a reminder of the true spirit of Christmas, a spirit of redemption, of love, and of hope.